In November 1215, a man named Pope Innocent III stood before a huge gathering in his Lateran palace in Rome. It was the Fourth Lateran Council. Over 400 bishops and 900 abbots were there. They came from all across Christendom. One of the many things they decided was to forbid priests from blessing trials by ordeal. This was a huge deal. Before this, if you were accused of a crime in England, say stealing a pig, the court might not look for witnesses. Instead, they might make you carry a red-hot piece of iron for 9 paces. A priest would be there. He would bless the iron and ask God to show a sign. They would wrap your hand in bandages. 3 days later, they'd unwrap it. If the wound was clean and healing, you were innocent. God had saved you. If it was festering, you were guilty. God had condemned you. This was justice. It was a direct appeal to the supernatural. But when Pope Innocent III and the council issued Canon 18, it pulled the rug out from under this whole system. Suddenly, the church's authority was removed from the ordeal. The magic was gone. English royal justices were in a bind. In 1219, King Henry III's government sent a letter to its judges. It basically said, we don't know what to do now that the Pope has banned ordeals. You'll have to figure something else out. What they figured out was the jury. Not a new invention, but it became the main tool. They started relying on groups of local men who knew the accused and the accuser. These men were asked to investigate, to hear from people who saw something, to look at the facts on the ground. They were put under oath to speak the truth. Their job was to deliver a true saying. In the Latin used by the court clerks, this was a verdictum. That phrase verdictum passed from Norman French into English. It became our word, verdict. The church, by making one legal decision in Rome, forced English society to find a new way to determine guilt and innocence. It forced a change from divine judgment to human judgment, from magic to evidence, and in doing so, it gave us one of the core words of our entire legal system. This happened over and over. The church was not just a place people went on Sundays, it was the law. It was the government, it was the school. Its language and ideas seeped into every crack of daily life. And they are still there, hiding in the words we use every single day. Number 10, a cheap scarf at a saint's fair became our word for trashy. In the year 679, a queen named Aethelthryth died in a monastery in Ely, a marshy island in eastern England. She had been a princess, married twice for political reasons, but insisted on remaining a virgin. She fled her second husband and founded a double monastery for men and women at Ely in 673. She was known for her piety. She wore rough wool, ate little, and spent her nights in prayer. Years before her death, she developed a large, painful tumor on her neck. She believed it was divine punishment for her vanity as a young girl when she loved wearing beautiful necklaces. After she died, her followers buried her in a simple wooden coffin, but 16 years later, in 695, her sister decided to move her body into a new stone sarcophagus inside the church. When they opened the coffin, they found Aethelthryth's body was undecayed. This was considered a miracle, a sign of sainthood. The abbess who examined the body also noted that the wound from the tumor on her neck had healed completely. A cult grew around her. She became Saint Aethelthryth. The Anglo-Saxons had trouble pronouncing her name, so it was shortened and softened. She became known as Saint Audrey. Her shrine at Ely became one of the most important pilgrimage sites in England. For hundreds of years, people traveled there to pray for healing and to honor the Virgin Queen, and like many important shrines, it hosted a huge annual fair. The fair took place on her feast day, October 17th. Merchants came from all over to sell their goods to the crowds of pilgrims. It was called St. Audrey's Fair. One of the most popular souvenirs sold at this fair was a type of silk or lace neckerchief. It was a local specialty. People bought them to remember their pilgrimage, but they also wore them because of the story of St. Audrey's neck tumor. Wearing a ribbon around the neck was thought to offer protection, especially against throat ailments. These colorful little scarves were known as St. Audrey's lace. The fair was a massive event. For a few days, the quiet monastery town was flooded with thousands of people. There was drinking, trading, and celebration, and like at any big fair, a lot of what was sold was cheap and quickly made. The St. Audrey's lace was often not high-quality silk. It was flimsy, colorful, and mass-produced for the pilgrim market. It was a bit gaudy. By the 1500s, people in London and other cities started using the phrase St. Audrey's lace as a kind of slang. The name got slurred together in common speech. St. Tawdry's became tawdry. Tawdry lace meant the cheap, showy neckerchiefs you could buy at the fair. It wasn't a compliment. It meant something that looked fancy from a distance, but was actually poor quality up close. By the early 1600s, the word had broken free from the lace itself. Shakespeare used it in The Winter's Tale. A character talks about the tawdry lace and other trinkets a peddler is selling. The word no longer just described a thing, it described a quality. The word tawdry came to mean anything cheap, vulgar, or gaudy. A word we now use to describe cheap jewelry or tasteless decorations started its life as the name of a 7th century Anglo-Saxon queen. Her piety created a shrine, the shrine created a pilgrimage, the pilgrimage created a fair, and the cheap souvenirs sold at that church fair gave us a word for something worthless that pretends to be valuable. The entire history of the word is tied to the medieval church's system of saints, relics, and the economy that grew up around them. Number 9, the left hand was once the devil's hand. In the 12th century, a monk named Edwine worked at Christ Church Priory in Canterbury. He was a scribe and an artist. He helped create a magnificent book known as the Edwine Psalter. It was a huge volume filled with the Psalms and beautiful illustrations. The Edwine and the other monks who worked on it lived in a world of strict order and powerful symbols. Everything had a meaning. But God was order, the devil was chaos, and this duality extended to everything, including the human body. The right hand was the hand of God. It was the hand of blessing, strength, and authority. In every illustration of Christ and majesty, his right hand is raised in a gesture of blessing. Their priests blessed the congregation with their right hand. A king held his scepter in his right hand. Oaths were sworn with the right hand raised. The Latin word for right was dexter. It gave us words like dexterity, meaning skillful. The left hand was the opposite. It was seen as weaker, less reliable, and unlucky. It was associated with the profane and the demonic. In paintings of the Last Judgment, Christ separates the saved from the damned. The saved, the sheep, are always on his right side, heading for heaven. The damned, the goats, are on his left, being herded into the fires of hell by demons. This imagery was everywhere. It was carved into the stone above church doorways. It was painted on the walls inside. Everyone saw it. Everyone understood it. The left was the side of damnation. The Latin word for left was sinister. To a Roman, the word simply meant left. It could also have a sense of being unlucky or ill-omened, because Roman augurs, priests who read the future from the flight of birds, considered birds appearing on the left to be a bad sign. When the church adopted Latin as its official language, it absorbed the word sinister, but it amplified the negative meaning. For centuries, sinister in church, Latin didn't just mean left. It carried all the weight of the church's deep-seated suspicion of the left side. The left was the side of weakness, deception, and evil. This belief was so strong, it affected everyday life. Left-handed children were often forced to write with their right hands. It was seen as correcting a natural flaw, a mark of deviance. The word sinister entered the English language in the 1400s. At first, it was used in heraldry, the system of coats of arms. A shield was read from the perspective of the person holding it. So the sinister side was the left side of the shield as you looked at it. But it didn't take long for the word's moral meaning to take over. People already associated the left with bad luck. They had Old English words for it, like lift, which also meant weak or foolish. But sinister came in from Latin, the language of God and the law. It sounded serious and official. It carried the full authority of the church's worldview. By the 16th century, sinister was being used in English to mean something corrupt, evil, or threatening. A sinister look wasn't a glance to the left. It was a look full of malice. A sinister plot was an evil one. The word had completed its journey from a simple direction to a powerful moral judgment. Today we use sinister without thinking about left or right. We talk about a sinister villain or a sinister plan, but the reason the word means evil is because for 1,000 years the medieval church taught that the left side was the side of the devil. That deep-seated cultural and religious bias is preserved forever in our language. Number 8, your rent was once paid in silver or in threats. Along the border between Scotland and England, in the 15th century, life was hard and dangerous. It was a lawless land. Great families like the Percys and the Douglases held power, but their authority was weak. Real power belonged to the armed bands of raiders who lived in the hills. They were known as the border reivers. They crossed the border to steal cattle, burn farms, and take prisoners for ransom. It was a way of life. In this violent world, the church was a major landowner. Abbeys like Kelso, Jedburgh, and Melrose in Scotland and Hexham in England owned vast estates. They had thousands of tenant farmers who worked the land. These farmers were supposed to be protected by the king, but the king's law didn't run far in the borderlands. So they had to find another way to survive. The farmers owed rent to the abbeys. In the medieval economy, this rent, or tribute, was called mail. The word comes from an Old English word, mal, which meant a lawsuit, a bargain, or a payment. If a farmer paid his rent in silver coins, it was called white mail. The French legal term was blanche argent, meaning white money. It was the preferred way to pay. It was clean and straightforward. But many farmers didn't have silver. They paid their rent in other ways. They might pay with a share of their crops, with livestock, or with days of labor on the abbey's own lands. This type of non-monetary payment was often called blackmail. The black here didn't mean evil. It just meant it wasn't white silver. It was a standard, if less desirable, form of rent. But the border reivers created a new and terrifying kind of payment. A reiver chief would approach a group of farmers, including the tenants of a powerful abbey. He would offer them a deal. Pay him a tribute, a mail, and his men would leave their farms alone. They wouldn't burn their crops or steal their cattle. In fact, they might even protect them from other raiding parties. This was protection money. This forced payment was also called blackmail. Here, the word black took on a new meaning. It was not black like produce from the dark earth. It was black because it was illegal. It was a shadow payment made under threat. It was a tribute paid to criminals, not to a legitimate landlord like an abbot or a king. For decades, both kinds of blackmail existed. A farmer might pay one kind to his abbey and another kind to the local reiver captain. The English and Scottish governments passed laws against paying blackmail to the reivers. A law from 1569 in England explicitly mentions the evil of paying a certain rate of money, corn, cattle, or other consideration. Commonly they're called blackmail. The church was caught in the middle of this. As landlords, they were supposed to protect their tenants. But often, they were powerless against the reivers. In some cases, abbeys themselves were forced to pay blackmail to protect their own lands and granges from being destroyed. Over time, the original meaning of blackmail, as rent paid in goods, faded away. The system of land tenure changed. But the other meaning, the one born in the violent borderlands, survived. The connection to threats and extortion was too strong. By the 18th century, blackmail meant only one thing: demanding payment from someone in exchange for not revealing a damaging secret. The word's journey started in the church's land management system. It was a technical term for a type of rent. But the violent, lawless reality of life on the edges of the kingdom twisted the word into something much darker. The church's role as a great feudal landlord created the context for the word to exist in the first place. Number 7, a weeping saint gave us our word for crying too much. In the English town of York, in the 1420s, a man named John, a baker, would close his shop to watch the plays. They were not held in a theater. They were performed on large, decorated wagons that moved through the streets. Each wagon was sponsored by one of the city's guilds. The weavers, the shipbuilders, the bakers, each guild performed one story from the Bible. Together, the plays told the whole story of the world, from creation to the Last Judgment. These were the York Mystery Plays. They were a huge part of medieval life. Most people could not read or write. The plays, along with the stained glass windows and carvings in the Great Minster, were their Bible. This is how they learned the stories of Adam and Eve, Noah, and Jesus. The actors were ordinary tradesmen. The language was plain English, not Latin, and the plays were full of raw emotion. One of the most emotional scenes in the whole cycle was the story of Mary Magdalene. She was portrayed as a great sinner who repented and became one of Christ's most devoted followers. The plays showed her at the foot of the cross, weeping. They showed her at the empty tomb on Easter morning crying because she thought someone had stolen Jesus' body. The medieval church placed a huge emphasis on the figure of Mary Magdalene. She was the perfect example of a repentant sinner. She was proof that anyone, no matter how low they had fallen, could be saved through sorrow and faith. Artists and writers depicted her constantly, and they almost always showed her weeping. Her eyes are red, her face is streaked with tears. She is the image of intense public grief. In medieval England, her name was not pronounced with a hard. It was pronounced more like Maud Eileen, and people started to associate the name Magdalene with the kind of theatrical weeping sorrow they saw in the plays and in religious art. By the 1500s, this connection started to appear in the language. Someone who was tearful or overly emotional was described as being maudlin. At first, it just meant tearful, but it quickly began to take on a negative sense. It didn't just mean sad. It meant excessively, embarrassingly emotional, crying in a way that makes other people uncomfortable. By the 1620s, the word was well established. A writer could talk about maudlin sinners, and everyone would know what he meant: people who make a big public show of their repentance, just like Mary Magdalene in the plays. The word also became associated with the kind of sad, self-pitying state a person gets into when they are drunk. A maudlin drunk is someone who weeps and tells everyone their problems after a few too many drinks. The journey of this word is remarkable. It starts with a real person, a follower of Jesus. The medieval church then builds her up into a major saint, a powerful symbol of repentance. This image of her always weeping is spread through art, sermons, and most importantly, through the popular religious plays that were a central part of town life. Her very name, Magdalene, became a synonym for the emotion she was famous for displaying. Today, when we call a sad movie Magdalene, we are using a word that is a direct echo of how a medieval baker in York would have seen an amateur actor on a wooden wagon pretending to be a weeping saint from the Bible. The word is a fossil, preserving a specific religious and cultural moment. Number 6, your closest friend at church became a spreader of rumors. In a small Anglo-Saxon village in the 10th century, a woman named Edburgh was about to have her first child christened. The priest would perform the baptism at the village church, but Edburgh and her husband, Leofwine, needed sponsors for the baby. They needed a godfather and a godmother. These were not just ceremonial roles, they were a sacred bond. The godparents were responsible for the child's spiritual education. If the parents died, the godparents might even raise the child. Edburgh asked her neighbor and friend, Ealfgifu, to be the godmother. When Ealfgifu agreed and stood with them at the baptism, she and Edburgh entered into a new kind of relationship. They were now spiritually related. In Old English, they were godsibs. The word was made of two parts, god and sib. Sib was an old word for a relative or kinsman. So a godsib was a relative in God. This was an incredibly important relationship in medieval society. Your godsibs were your family. You were bound to them by an oath made in church. They were the people you could rely on. They were your closest confidants. The men who were godsibs would drink together, work together, and defend each other. The women who were godsibs would help each other in childbirth, share food, and mind each other's children. And because they were so close, they talked. They shared news. They talked about who was getting married, whose crops were failing, who was sick. They talked about the latest pronouncements from the lord of the manor or the priest. They were the hubs of the local information network. They shared what we would now call news and rumors. They were gossips. For several hundred years, the word gossip kept its original meaning. It meant a godparent, a close friend, a kinsman. In the 1300s, Chaucer used gossip in the Canterbury Tales to mean a close female friend or neighbor. The sense of intimacy was still there, but the meaning was beginning to shift, because gossips were primarily women's close friends. The word started to become associated specifically with the talk of women. In a society run by men, women's conversation was often dismissed as trivial, unimportant, and idle. So the talk of gossips, the very act of them sharing news and confidences, started to be seen in a negative light. By the 1500s, the change was well underway. A gossip was no longer just a close friend. It was a person, usually a woman, who delights in talking about other people's lives. The sacred meaning of being a relative in God was almost entirely lost. The focus was now on the act of talking. Shakespeare used the word in this new sense. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, he writes of a gossip's bowl, a drink shared by women as they chat. By the 1800s, the word had transformed completely. Gossip no longer referred to a person at all. It referred to the talk itself. Idle chatter, rumors, and scandalous stories about others. The noun for the person had become the noun for their speech. The word's entire history is rooted in a central sacrament of the medieval church, baptism. The church created the sacred relationship of the godsib. The very structure of village life, centered around the parish church, fostered the close-knit communities where these relationships thrived. But over time, society's view of the intimate conversations that happened within these sacred friendships soured. A word that once meant the deepest spiritual kinship now means the most trivial and often hurtful kind of talk. Number 5, the only people who could write were men of the church. Imagine a wool merchant in London in the year 1380. His name is Thomas. His business is growing. He buys wool from farmers in the Cotswolds and sells it to weavers from Flanders. And he has to keep track of his purchases, his sales, his debts, and his profits, but Thomas cannot read or write. Almost no one in his world can unless they are part of the church. Literacy was a specialized skill and the church had a monopoly on it. From the smallest village priest to the most powerful bishop, clergymen were the administrators, the secretaries, and the record keepers of the medieval world. The word for a person in holy orders, a clergyman, was clericus in Latin. So when Thomas the merchant needed someone to keep his accounts, he hired a young man who had been educated in a church school. This young man could read, write, and do arithmetic. He might have been destined for the priesthood, but decided to use his skills in the world of commerce instead. Because of his education and his ability to write, everyone called him a clericus, or, in the Norman French spoken by the upper classes, a clerk. This is the origin of our word clerk. For centuries, the words cleric and clerk meant the same thing: a clergyman, a man of the church. Because literacy was their exclusive domain, the word for a churchman became the word for a writer, a record keeper, or a scholar. If you could write your name, you were a clerk. The famous benefit of clergy was a legal privilege in England. If a man was on trial for a crime, he could claim to be a clergyman. To prove it, he had to read a passage from the Bible, usually the first verse of Psalm 51. If he could read it, the secular court had to hand him over to the church court, which would give a much lighter sentence. For a long time, being able to read was legal proof that you were a man of the church. As the Middle Ages progressed, society grew more complex. Governments and businesses needed more and more literate people. The number of non-ordained men who worked as secretaries, scribes, and accountants grew. These men were all called clerks. By the 1400s, the two meanings began to split apart. The spelling cleric came to be used exclusively for a person in holy orders. The spelling clerk came to refer to a professional writer or administrator. The link to the church was still there, but it was becoming more distant. A clerk was someone who did the work of a cleric reading and writing without necessarily being one. The split shows a major change in society. It marks the moment when literacy began to escape from the confines of the monastery and the cathedral. But the language remembers the old reality, the fact that our word for an office worker clerk is just a slightly different spelling of our word for priest cleric, is a direct result of the medieval church's complete control over education and the written word. Every time we talk about a desk clerk, a law clerk, or a county clerk, we are using a word that once meant a man of God. The term is a linguistic fossil that tells the story of a time when the ability to read and write was a skill held almost exclusively by the institution that shaped the entire Western world. Number 4, a forbidden Bible translation gave us a word for blaming others. In 1524, an English priest and scholar named William Tyndale fled from England to Germany. He was a fugitive. His crime was his determination to translate the Bible into English. This was illegal. The church, with the backing of the king, had forbidden it. The authorities believed that only priests trained in Latin should interpret the scriptures. They feared that if ordinary people could read the Bible for themselves, it would lead to heresy and social unrest. Tyndale believed the opposite. He famously told another clergyman, If God spare my life, ere many years I will cause a boy that driveth the plough shall know more of the scripture than thou dost. He worked in hiding in German cities like Cologne and Worms. He used the original Hebrew and Greek texts, not just the official Latin Vulgate. He wanted his translation to be clear, direct, and accessible to everyone. In 1530, he published his translation of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch. When he got to the 16th chapter of Leviticus, he faced a problem. The chapter describes a ritual for the Day of Atonement. The high priest is instructed to take 2 goats. One is sacrificed to God, the other is brought forward. The priest lays his hands on its head and confesses over it all the sins of the people of Israel. And then the goat is led out into the wilderness to be released, symbolically carrying away the sins of the community. The Hebrew text for this second goat was difficult. The word was Azazel. Scholars had debated its meaning for centuries. Some thought it was the name of a demon that lived in the desert. The Latin Vulgate Bible had translated it as Caper Emissarius, the emissary goat. Or Tyndale needed a simple, powerful English word for this goat. He wanted the plowboy in England to understand exactly what was happening in the ritual. He looked at the role the goat played. It was the goat that was allowed to escape, so he created a new word. He combined escape and goat. He called it the scapegoat. It was a brilliant piece of translation. It captured the essence of the ritual in a single, easily understood compound word. In his translation of Leviticus chapter 16, verse 10, Tyndale wrote, "But the goat, on which the lot fell to be the scapegoat, shall be set alive before the Lord, to carry all their misdeeds upon him into the wilderness." Over time, the E at the beginning was dropped, and the word became scapegoat. The church had long taught the theology behind this ritual. They taught that Christ was the ultimate scapegoat, the one who carried the sins of the world. But it was Tyndale, the man the church declared a heretic, who gave the English language the actual word. His work was revolutionary and dangerous. His Bibles were smuggled into England, where they were burned in public. Tyndale himself was eventually betrayed, arrested in 1535, and executed the following year for heresy. But his translation was too powerful to suppress. Its language was so clear and resonant that it formed the basis for almost every English Bible that followed, including the King James Version of 1611. His words and phrases entered the mainstream of the English language. The word scapegoat stayed in the language, but its meaning broadened. By the 19th century, it was no longer just used in a religious context. It came to mean any person or group who is unfairly blamed for the mistakes or crimes of others. We talk about politicians looking for a scapegoat to blame for a failed policy. We talk about a team's manager being made the scapegoat for a lost season. The word is now completely secular, but it was born from a priest's effort to make a specific, obscure Old Testament ritual understandable to ordinary people. It is a product of the great religious struggles of the late Middle Ages and the Reformation. The medieval church's strict control over the Bible and one man's defiant and ultimately fatal attempt to break that control gave us a word we still use to describe a fundamental and often dark aspect of human nature. Number 3, your day off from work was once a day for God. In the year 1250, a farmer named Hugh lived in a village in Oxfordshire. His life was governed by the sun and the seasons. He worked from dawn until dusk, 6 days a week. His work was backbreaking: plowing, sowing, weeding, and harvesting. There was always something to do. There were no weekends in the modern sense. There was no concept of a 2-day break for rest and leisure. There was only the work and the Lord's Day. Sunday was different. On Sunday, Hugh did not go to the fields. The church commanded that Sunday was a day of rest, in honor of God resting on the 7th day of creation. Going to church was not optional. The village priest would ring the church bell, and the entire village would gather to hear the Mass. The service was in Latin, which Hugh did not understand, but he knew the rituals. He knew it was a sacred time. But Sunday was not the only day of rest. The church calendar was filled with other special days. There were major feasts like Christmas, Easter, and Pentecost. And there were dozens of saints' days. St. Stephen's Day, St. John's Day, the Feast of the Holy Innocents, all right after Christmas. There was Candlemas in February, St. Peter's Day in June, Michaelmas in September. On these days, all servile work was forbidden. They were days for religious observance. In Old English, these special days were called haligdag. It was a simple compound word, halig meaning holy and dag meaning day. A haligdag was a holy day. For Hugh the farmer, these holy days were the only breaks he had from constant labor. They were economically significant. It's estimated that in the Middle Ages, people had between 80 and 100 of these non-working days a year, including Sundays. This was a source of tension. Landlords sometimes complained that there were too many holy days, that they were bad for productivity. But the church's authority was absolute. The word Helidig evolved over time. The pronunciation softened. By the time of Chaucer in the late 1300s, it was spelled and pronounced holiday, and it still meant a religious festival. In the prologue to the Canterbury Tales, Chaucer describes the pilgrims setting out in the spring, a time when people long to go on pilgrimages and the sun is bright after the Lenten holiday. He meant the holy season of Lent and Easter. After the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, things began to change. The new Church of England dramatically cut the number of saints' days. Many of the old holidays, the ones dedicated to the Virgin Mary or minor saints, were abolished. The calendar became much emptier, but the word holiday remained. It was too deeply embedded in the language. The meaning of the word began to shift. It became detached from its purely religious sense. A holiday was still a day when you didn't work, but it wasn't necessarily for a religious reason. The state began to create its own non-working days. In the 19th century, Sir John Lubbock introduced the Bank Holiday Act of 1871, creating the first secular public holidays in Britain. Today, we use holiday to mean any day off from work or school. We talk about summer holidays, bank holidays, or going on holiday for a vacation. The original meaning is almost completely gone. For most people, a holiday has nothing to do with being holy. But the word itself is a direct link to the medieval world. Its very structure, holy day, tells us that for 1,000 years, the only reason an ordinary person ever got a day off from work was because the church ordered it. Our modern idea of leisure and time off is built on a foundation of religious obligation. Every time we look forward to a public holiday, we are using a word that was born in the rhythm of the medieval church's calendar. Number 2, a priest's sacred Latin became a magician's nonsense word. In a cold stone church in rural England around 1450, a peasant named William knelt on the floor. He could not understand the words the priest was saying at the altar. The Mass was entirely in Latin, the language of the church, not the English he spoke every day. He knew the shape of the service. He knew when to stand, when to kneel, and when to bow his head. He knew the most important moment was coming. The priest, with his back to the congregation, would hold up a small, round wafer of unleavened bread. He would speak the words of consecration. These were the words Jesus spoke at the Last Supper, the most sacred words in the entire Christian faith. He would say, "Hoc est enim corpus meum," this is my body. At that moment, according to the doctrine of transubstantiation, a miracle occurred. The bread was no longer bread. It was transformed into the actual body of Christ. The priest would then elevate the host for the people to see. A bell would be rung for William. This was the central mystery of his faith. He could not see the change, but the church taught him it was real. It was a moment of profound and mysterious power, but he didn't hear the distinct Latin words, "Hoc est corpus meum." He heard a mumbled, rhythmic phrase that sounded something like "hocus pocus." For centuries, this was the experience of the uneducated laity across Europe. They were spectators at a sacred drama performed in a foreign tongue. The holiest words of the Mass were, to their ears, a mysterious incantation. The situation changed dramatically with the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. Reformers like Martin Luther and William Tyndale attacked the doctrine of transubstantiation. They did not believe a miracle took place on the altar. They saw the Mass as a piece of theatrical trickery, a magic show designed to fool the common people and keep them dependent on the priesthood. To mock the Catholic Mass, these reformers began to use the very words of consecration as a term of ridicule. They took the slurred, half-heard phrase, hocus pocus, and turned it into a synonym for deception and sleight of hand. An early Protestant writer named Adoctus Nix Prael wrote a book in 1675 attacking the Catholic Church, in which he claimed that the term hocus pocus was a direct, deliberate parody of hocus corpus. The phrase quickly caught on with street performers, jugglers, and magicians. They saw it as the perfect piece of gibberish to say while performing a trick. It sounded mysterious and important, just like the Latin of the priests. When a magician pulled a rabbit from a hat, he might say hocus pocus to distract the audience and add to the sense of wonder. The phrase became part of the language of stage magic. It meant a trick, a deception, a bit of nonsense intended to confuse. The journey of this phrase is one of the most extreme transformations in the English language. It started as the most sacred formula in medieval Christianity, the words that were believed to perform a literal miracle. It was the heart of the central sacrament of the church. But because the church insisted on keeping its liturgy in a language that people could not understand, those sacred words became vulnerable. They were heard as a meaningless chant. And when the religious authority of the church was challenged, its most holy phrase was turned into a joke. It became the name for the very thing. The reformers accused the church of practicing meaningless trickery. Today, hocus pocus is just a silly, old-fashioned phrase from children's magic shows, but its origin lies in the deep and bitter theological disputes that tore the medieval world apart. It is a linguistic scar left over from the battle over the Eucharist, a permanent echo of the sound of Latin in a medieval English church. Number 1, your last words when leaving are a medieval prayer. On a dusty road in England in the 14th century, two pilgrims meet. One is heading to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury. The other is returning from a pilgrimage to Walsingham. They walk together for a few miles, sharing stories and bread. Travel in the Middle Ages was dangerous. There were no police forces. Robbers were common. A sudden illness or an injury from a fall could be a death sentence. Every journey was uncertain. When they reach a crossroads where their paths diverge, they must part. They do not say see you later or take care. The moment of parting is more serious than that. They know they might never see each other again. So they say a prayer for each other. One of them says, "God be with ye." It was not a casual phrase. It was a genuine blessing, a formal leave-taking. It was a request for God to accompany the other person on their journey, to protect them from harm. You was the formal, plural form of you in Middle English. The phrase was a shortened version of "May God be with you." It was used in all sorts of situations, not just long journeys. A mother might say it to her son as he left for the fields. A knight would say it to his men before a battle. It was the standard way to say farewell. The phrase was so common, used so many times a day by so many people that it began to get worn down. The sounds started to run together. People are always looking for linguistic shortcuts. Just as going to becomes gonna, God be with you began to shrink. By the 1500s, you can see the change happening in written text. In a letter from 1573, a writer signs off with God be why. The separate words were starting to merge into one. The playwrights of the Elizabethan era captured this change perfectly. In Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, written around 1597, Mercutio says, "God ye good den, a slurring of God give you a good evening." In another play from the same period, you can find the line God by you, a further shortening of God be with you. By the early 1600s, the contraction was complete. God be with ye had been compressed into a single word, goodbye. The transformation was so total that within a few generations, most people forgot where the word came from. It no longer felt like a prayer or a blessing. It was just a word. It was the thing you said when you were leaving. Its religious meaning was bleached out of it by centuries of repetition, but the history is locked inside the word itself. Good is a remnant of God. By is what is left of be with ye. It's a perfect piece of linguistic archaeology. Dig into the most common everyday word for parting, and you find the medieval worldview right at its core. You find a world where the presence of God was a constant, real concern, and where invoking his protection was the most natural thing to do when facing the uncertainties of life. Today, people of all faiths, and of no faith at all, use the word goodbye a dozen times a day without a second thought. An atheist leaving the office for the day will say goodbye to their colleagues. The word has become completely secular. It is perhaps the most secret and most profound way the medieval church still shapes how we speak. Hiding in plain sight, in our final words at every parting, is a 700-year-old prayer.